Stepmother Susan was sorting through her new stepson Brian's shirt. When she noticed the torn collar, she frowned and ran her fingers thoughtfully over the torn fabric. Susan retreated to her room, and by the loud banging on the door, Brian already knew there were questions for him. He barely had time to turn off the website that showed a mature blonde woman who bore a striking resemblance to his stepmother. Susan entered the room, and her gaze immediately fell on Brian, who looked visibly agitated. Brian, by the way, was in his early 20s, a freshman in college and getting used to the new responsibilities that came with adulthood. "Brian, explain what this is," she asked, pointing to the torn shirt, curiosity and slight irritation audible in her voice. "It was an accident," he muttered, awkwardly averting his eyes. After half an hour of questions and stares, Susan realized everything. She thought Brian was happy at college, but apparently something was wrong. The torn shirt spoke to that. Her husband, Mark, had just gotten a big project at work, and instead of a family vacation, he was stocking up at the office. That gave Susan a lot of free time, on top of household chores and regular fitness classes. Now she had a lot to think about. She couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was bothering Brian, and she felt the need to help him. Susan decided to take a more active role in her stepson's upbringing. She spent the next few days watching him closely and noticing small changes in his behavior. He seemed withdrawn, thoughtful, and even a little sad. She wanted to help him, but she knew she had to approach it delicately. There was a vulnerability in Brian that made her protective instincts kick in, and she wanted to make sure he was okay. She was going to go to the gym in a few days. Standing in the hallway in front of the mirror, she admired her appearance. She was 38, but she looked amazing, a beautiful, mature blonde with real confidence shining through. She was proud of her fitness and the fact that she was managing to stay young. Today, Susan wore a tight gray knit dress with a slit on the side that went almost to her panties. She fixed her hair and smiled at her reflection, knowing she looked good. Brian came out of his room and hesitated when he saw her. The dress fit her perfectly, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. "So, how do you like me?" Susan turned to her stepson and smiled, her eyes sparkling mischievously. At that moment, Brian came out of his daze, stammering slightly. "You look great," he managed to say, quickly averting his eyes as his cheeks flushed. "There you go again," she teased and then added, "I'm leaving." With those words, she left the apartment, clicking her heels on the floor, the sound echoing down the hallway. Later, at the gym, Susan decided it was time to talk to Brian directly. She returned home and set to work in the kitchen, preparing an elaborate dinner. She wanted to create an atmosphere where Brian could open up to her. She carefully chopped vegetables, seasoned the meat, and set the table with her best dishes. Brian sat at the computer as usual, his face illuminated by the light of the screen. After about 15 minutes, Susan called out, "Brian, honey, come here." Brian walked into the kitchen and marveled at how beautiful and appetizing everything looked, dishes neatly arranged, the smell of roasting herbs in the air, and Susan standing there looking like a vision. "Susan, are you?" he began, but she interrupted him with a soft smile. "Sit down, Brian. We need to talk." She poured a glass of wine, making Brian's eyes widen. "And wine? For dinner?" he asked with surprise in his voice, frowning slightly. "For appetite," Susan replied with a knowing smile, her eyes stopping on his. She handed him a glass and took one for herself, her fingers lingering on his fingers a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you. I wouldn't mind if you joined me," he said, his voice softening as he looked at her, and the warmth of her smile made him relax. They drank one bottle, then another, and soon Brian's gaze on Susan became different, strangely intense, filled with something more than admiration. Susan felt it too, but tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. Her heart was racing in response to his lingering glances. "Listen, Brian, what happened at college? Did you guys have a fight?" she asked in a soft and inviting tone, hoping to give him a chance to open up about it. "Yeah, some guys used to bully me all the time, even in front of girls. I used to fight back, but it was the same old thing," Brian admitted, his shoulders slumping slightly, and he stared down at the table, clutching the rim of his glass in his fingers. "What about girls? Have you had someone special yet?" Susan asked, looking over his face for any sign of hope. Brian blushed and looked down at the floor. "Not yet." "I see. It must be hard," Susan said softly, her voice filled with sympathy. "But I'm here for you, Brian. I want you to know that, no matter what." The young man sat up, his face flushed, either from wine or embarrassment. There was an awkward pause before Brian finally spoke. "I don't know if I can stop looking at you, Susan. I like you, a lot, and there's nothing I can do about it," he said, his voice trembling slightly and his eyes meeting hers, and the honesty of his gaze took Susan's breath away. There was so much sincerity in his voice that Susan felt her cheeks warm. Her heart raced as she realized the intensity of his feelings. For a moment she hesitated, not knowing what to do, but the longing in his eyes drew her to him. When he leaned in and kissed her, she melted, the warmth of his lips sending shivers down her spine. A pleasant shiver ran through her body as she realized how much she wanted this. Susan didn't hesitate. She took the inexperienced young man's hand and led him along, her mind buzzing with emotions she hadn't felt in years. Thus began their story. Passion overwhelmed them, leaving no room for anything else in the apartment. The minutes they spent together were intense, hot, and filled with unbridled play. Every time they were alone together, the air between them seemed to spark with electricity, the tension impossible to ignore. They glanced furtively at each other, touched each other in passing, each touch lingering a little longer than the last, each moment adding fuel to the fire that was steadily consuming them. Susan had never imagined herself in this position, and yet here she was, giving in to something she couldn't control. She looked forward to being alone with him, longed for his touch, and the way he looked at her with undisguised admiration. It was intoxicating. The secrecy only heightened the sharpness of the sensations, making each moment even more intense. She began wearing clothes she knew he liked, casually touching him, enjoying the way his eyes followed her. Their affair quickly became the center of both of their lives. Brian began skipping classes to spend more time with her at home. He looked forward to Susan finishing her chores so they could be together. Susan began to neglect some of the chores around the house. Her thoughts were consumed with Brian. They would find secluded corners in the apartment to exchange hurried kisses, and their passion never seemed to wane. Nights were the worst. The tension became unbearable until they finally sank into each other's arms, and their shared desire made the world outside their apartment disappear from their shared desire. Susan knew it was dangerous. She knew it couldn't last forever. But for now, she let herself live in the moment, savoring the feeling of being wanted, of being needed in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if she had found a part of herself that had been missing, and Brian had brought her back to life. She felt young again, her body responding to his touch with a fervor that she thought had long since faded. To Brian, Susan was everything he had ever dreamed of. She was beautiful, confident, and caring. She listened to him, understood him, and made him feel like he mattered. She was the first woman to make him feel that way, and he was hopelessly drawn to her. He didn't care about the consequences. He only knew that he wanted her and would do anything to keep what they had. The way she looked at him, the way she touched him, made him feel like he was the only person in the world that mattered, the only person in the world that mattered. The apartment, once so spacious and lonely, was now filled with the energy of their affair. The walls held their secrets, confessions spoken in whispers, and stolen moments of passion. It was a world that belonged only to them, a bubble shutting them off from the rest of the world, if only temporarily. They spent hours talking, laughing, loving, and the rest of the world became insignificant to them. They created memories that only they could share, moments that belonged only to them, hidden from everyone else. Each day their relationship grew deeper. Susan found herself caring for Brian in ways she hadn't even realized. She cooked for him, listened to his problems, and helped him navigate the complexities of adulthood. She became his confidant, partner, and lover. The lines between good and evil blurred as their bond deepened, and neither of them wanted to stop. Brian was changing, too. He was becoming more confident, more self-sufficient. Susan's love had transformed him, giving him strength he never knew he had. He became more assertive, going from a timid and insecure man to someone who knew what he wanted. And what he wanted most of all was Susan. Their love for each other was all-consuming and burned brightly, fiercely, with no regard for what lay ahead. The apartment that had seemed empty before was now filled with laughter, whispers, moments of tenderness neither of them had expected. And though they both knew the risks, realized it couldn't last forever, they couldn't bring themselves to stop. For now, they were content to live in the bubble they had created, allowing themselves to lose themselves in each other, even if only briefly. And for Susan, who had felt unappreciated and unnoticed for so long, Brian was the one who made her feel alive again, who made her believe that happiness could be found in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like and be sure to subscribe. It's important to me as a woman. Thank you all for watching. See you in new stories.